The following presentation on Xaverian Ecclesiality invites us to reflect on the way we relate to ecclesiastical leadership. What is the place of consecrated men in the church? It would be easy to think that the answer to this question is obvious, if not long resolved in theology. The truth, however, is that there was a lot of theological contention before the Second Vatican Council regarding the place of consecrated men and women in the church. Because of its acknowledged unique origin in the history of the church, that is, a life form that originated separately from the clerical and hierarchical structure of the church, theologians had debated for centuries whether or not religious life was actually part of the ecclesial reality, the reality of the church. Among non-theologians, however, the question regarding the place of consecrated men and women in the church was something more different. For the average Catholics before the Second Vatican Council, and even for average Catholics in non-Western countries today, consecrated men are part of a clergy-dominated church. In the mind of many, vowed religious are part of a special group, chosen by God by virtue of their vow of chastity. And just like ordained priests, we were seen as being set apart from the laity, especially chosen, if not favored by God. In the understanding and imagination of many, our location within the church's power structure was somewhere between the ordained and the laity. And because of this, we are and were expected to be different, to look different, to behave differently from the average lay Catholics. It was the Second Vatican Council that set into motion a serious reconsideration about the identity and the location of vowed religious in the church. In harmony with its renewed concept that all baptized members constitute the people of God, each of whom are called by God to be priest, prophet, and servant king, the Second Vatican Council clarified our place within the ecclesial reality by stating that religious life, quote, is not an intermediate state between the clerical and lay states. Rather, the faithful of Christ who live the religious life form are called by God from both the clerical and lay states of life, end quote. For us religious brothers, this would imply that we are foundationally lay persons, not clerics, not even quasi-clerics, and therefore invited by the church to make certain that it is evident that we are neither clerics or quasi-clerics, especially to the people that we serve. However, those called to our life are summoned to discover, accept, and develop a particular gift, a particular charism which marks this life form, that is, the call to vow for celibacy, for the sake of the overall mission of the church. Another crucial realization that developed as a result of the Second Vatican Council is that religious life is a reality within the church, a life form that is a gift of God to the world. Thus, religious life is an ecclesial reality, not simply because of the obvious presence of consecrated women and men in the church, but it is because it is an essential element of the church. However, religious life coexists with another ecclesial reality, the clerical hierarchy. Both are ecclesial realities. Both are constituted by the people of God. Both, in the mind of the council, are called to become a visible sacrament of the love and mercy of God to all women and men. But both realities did not take their final form and shape immediately. Both took those final forms with much difficulty, and they evolved through 2 millennia into what they look like today. Although religious life and the clerical hierarchy developed side by side, their growth was marked by conflicts from the onset. On one hand, the clerical leadership understands that it has received from Christ, quote, the duty of discerning gifts and competencies, of coordinating multiple energies, and of caring for religious charisms. Thus, by fostering religious life and protecting it in conformity with its own definite characteristics, bishops fulfill a real pastoral duty, end of quote. On the other hand, religious life originates from groups born out of the prophetic insights of founders who were called to lead lives that actively resisted ambition, entitlement, and indulgence, at times as a needed counter-witness to the privileged life led by members of the clerical leadership. Because of this, one can easily understand why there has always been the tendency for clerical leadership and religious life to be in conflict with each other. At the root of the problem is that the very origin of consecrated life was outside the realms of the clerical leadership. In an address given by Pope John Paul II in January 1986, he synthesized what he saw as the beginning of religious life in the following manner. Quote, religious life began in specifically lay form. It sprang from the desire of some faithful Christians to harvest the abundant fruits of their baptismal grace and to free themselves from the obstacles which might have distanced them from fervent charity and the perfection of divine worship. The earliest religious in the church clearly distinguished themselves from those who occupied clerical offices. They sought a way of following Christ that was deeply attuned to the calls of the gospel, but away from an ecclesiastical leadership that they felt was increasingly becoming privileged and entitled. However, even if they chose to distance themselves from these privileges and entitlements, the earliest religious in the church did not see themselves as forming an elite body who enjoyed more closeness to God compared to the other members of the faithful. Like other believers, the earliest religious were strongly committed to a life which entailed the proclamation of the word, also known as kerygma, public worship, also known as liturgia, service to the neediest and to each other, also known as diaconia, living in common, also known as koinonia, and witnessing to Christ even at the risk of martyrdom, also known as martyria. However, something had always set them apart. To the 5 Christian commitments already mentioned, the early religious added the practices of voluntary celibacy, dedicated asceticism, and fervent contemplation. And it is from these practices that the vows for chastity, poverty, and obedience would later develop. Because of this intensity of living the Christian life and a strong aversion toward privileges and entitlements, leaders and founders of the early religious communities were vehemently opposed to accepting clerics into their numbers. Of St. Pachomius, the acknowledged father of the Cenobitic life, the following was written in the 4th century, quote, our father Pachomius did not want any clerics in his monasteries for fear of jealousy and vainglory. Very often, indeed, he would talk to them on this subject. It is better not to seek after such a thing in our community, lest this should be an occasion for strife, envy, jealousy, and even schisms to arise in large number of monks, contrary to God's will, end of quote. A century later, Cassian, another pioneer of religious life, gave the following counsel to his followers. Quote, "Brethren, do not let yourself be drawn to the diabolical temptation of seeking clerical office out of a desire to bring spiritual help to others." Now, it should be clearly noted that, of course, there were other pioneers of the consecrated life who accepted readily clerics into their monasteries. Important figures like Saint Basil, Saint Augustine, both of whom were bishops, as well as Saint Benedict, who was a layman. They were not opposed to even ordaining the monks in their monasteries. However, even in these clerical-friendly monasteries, the founders emphasized that the primordial obligation for the ordained lies in their fidelity, first and foremost, to their monastic calling. Saint Benedict himself permitted the ordination of monks with the following stringent counsel. Quote, "Let the one who is ordained beware of self-exaltation or pride. Let him not presume to do anything except what is commanded him by the abbot, knowing that he is so much the more subject to the discipline of the rule. Nor should he, by reason of his priesthood, forget the obedience and the discipline required by the rule, but make ever more and more progress towards God." End of quote. This reservation against ordaining monks gradually reversed during the Middle Ages, so much so that by the 9th century, emperors as well as popes were intensely promoting the ordination of monks, so much so that by the start of the 2nd millennium, it became the normative practice in monasteries to ordain them. As the centuries passed, the tension between consecrated life and clerical leadership became more obvious, especially as a result of the increased tendency among bishops and priests to see themselves as divinely foreordained to be at the very top of the church's structure. Founders of religious congregations, even those who were seemingly subservient to the hierarchy, were for the most part aware of this tendency on the part of bishops and priests. It would be wrong for us to generalize that they, as Catholics of a different time and of a different mentality, simply accepted the burden imposed on their shoulders, the reality of this divide. The truth is far more complex than that. Founders understood that the awesome responsibility given to them by the Spirit cannot be fulfilled without the leadership of the Church. Thus, one can say that in spite of their difficulties with bishops and the compromises that they had to make, founders were ecclesial-minded individuals. They were not naive to the abuses of power and even fought these. In the end, however, they understood that they belong to the whole church and that they have to find some way of relating effectively with the church's hierarchy for the sake of founding and stabilizing the religious family that they were called to found. At this point, let us pause for a while and reflect on the following questions. Number 1, how have I personally experienced and lived this conflict between religious life and clerical leadership? Number 2, in my opinion, could we as Xaverians today live our life form and mission apart from or alongside the clerical leadership? Please explain. We will resume the presentation after you have done your reflection and sharing.